Good morning. I have with me this morning Ben Askins, or should we say Doc, or should we say Deadpool, or should we say anti-hero's journey? What should we call you?
Yeah, I'm nobody. You can pick any of that. If you make eye contact and noise, I'll pay attention.
I love that I'm nobody because I'm everything. I've read your book. I listened to it again this morning as I was running. We were kind of talking beforehand. I have this morning ritual where I get up every morning at 4:30. I have this long conversation with God in a journal. I do a lot of reading, and then bam, I have an 8-year-old who does not sleep either. And he graces me with his presence usually around 5:45, 6 o'clock. So I have to do a lot of things before he basically takes over. So this morning was actually it was so beautiful for me because I was listening to you and your story about when you were 8, and I want to get into that. But first, I'm going to ask you the same question that he asked me yesterday morning while I was having this really great conversation. If you were standing outside and you saw a shooting star and you could make any wish that there was, what would you wish for?
Yeah, I think I would want all the people in the world to have like a direct line connection with their creator, with the source of all life, and be able to live out of the access to that, even whenever it's difficult. That's kind of my way of saying world peace, I guess.
So I asked my wife the same question yesterday, and she said world peace.
Yeah.
I love your answer way better. So,
I'm trying to figure out a method for getting it anyway, Yeah.
I actually said, so my son is 8, and he is in this How to Train Your Dragon phase. And he was so beautiful. He sat on my lap and he said, I wish dragons were real.
Yeah.
And then I thought about it, and he said, what's your wish? And I immediately said, mini cows, mini donkeys, and mini sheep, because I talk to my kids. I have this dream that I have these 2 empty lots next door, and I want to have a barn, and I want to have all these animals for people to be able to come in and actually have therapy and be able to hold space.
Yeah.
Like that's like a dream of mine. And they're like,
beautiful.
And my son's like, well, we're already going to have that. So
that's already a done deal, Dad. You
so
didn't
then
sign the papers
he equates it back to How to Train Your Dragon, because there's a scene where the dragon riders throw sheep and they catch them and they throw them into a basket. Right. But I loved the purity of being able to have that kind of thought process. But for you, when you were 8, things were a little different. You thought about things different. You thought about being alone. And tell me about that. Like, that really touched me this morning, because I'm listening to this and I have such a great relationship with my son that I immediately kind of flipped it from your point of view.
Yeah. I don't know if I was, I don't know how to explain it, I guess, but at 8 years old, I was very existentially aware. I was aware that this life is brief, that there's an ending to it. And I was aware that I was very dependent on 2 much larger human beings than me to figure out how to sustain that existence. And it would keep me awake at night sometimes. What would I do without them? What if something happens to them? The what ifs, that like existential fear and dread that usually waits till you're a bit older to show up and start, rattling you around, was keeping me awake at night, I wrote the book last year, and I wrote the book last year, and my youngest daughter was 9 at the time, and she was having the same sorts of things going on, where she'd be up at night, come in and wake my wife and I up and say, hey, I'm terrified of the end of this thing, of death and some of that sort of stuff. So like some death anxiety on like a, French existentialist philosopher level was something maybe I passed on to her, that maybe I inherited from my, epigenetic line or whatever. But it was helpful to me to have worked through some of that in the process of writing the book, to be able then to relate to my daughter, who was in the same sort of headspace, and to recognize that may be natural and healthy for somebody to be working through, rather than like trying to figure out how to hospitalize her or medicate her, but to find some of the answers that would comfort her without fairy tales entirely, like trying to, like she's so smart, she's way smarter than me, and would see through like stuff that I'd try to make up to try to comfort her or whatever. She'd be like, you're just saying that so I'll go to sleep. And I'm like, yeah, I absolutely am, because I'm exhausted. I want you to go to sleep. Like, we're having like these, collegial level conversations with an 8 or 9-year-old girl who's just whip smart and like trying to figure that stuff out.
As you're saying this, I'm thinking about, so I have a 10-year-old who just turned 10, same thing. I mean, we always say old souls because there is no telling a story to my daughter. Like there's just, I mean, not that my son isn't smart in his own way, but my daughter is like light years ahead, and it is just amazing. She's like the responsible one of all of us.
Right. I'm very open to considering that there's that whatever happens after this life is a mystery. Maybe we can figure out some evidence for what it is. There's evidence that Dr. Stan Grof, the famous psychedelic researcher, calls holotropic data, that over and over again in psychedelic experiences people have connection with the concept of reincarnation in one form or another, and that's a very common belief about the afterlife, both in Eastern religions and in some Western, even like Gnostic Christian traditions. That's the view of the afterlife. And I'm probably on like my second or third go around, and my daughter's probably on like her 3,000th life, is what I figure at this point. She's just way far out ahead of me.
So I wasn't prepared to go there, but I believe the same thing. I do. I believe that I've been here before, but I believe that my kids are here to teach me lessons. And I feel like the tragedy of all of that is that when we're children, such a simple question of what would you do on a wishing star, we lose all that as we get older, and then we become something that we weren't meant to be. So let's talk about that. So you're 8 years old. You have all of these feelings about, and I'm trying to remember if I did. I had so much trauma growing up that I think at 8 I was just trying to survive. Like I was already severely in depression. I had a lot of other things that had happened to me before that. I mean, a lot of things that unfortunately took me until the last few years to be able to heal.
Sure.
But you're now having all these questions, and it's taken you down an interesting road. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So the way that I describe my childhood is that it was a loving, sometimes occasionally surprisingly violent childhood. So I don't know that it was continuously tragically traumatic like some people's childhoods, but my dad was a Vietnam vet, raised by a World War II vet. We all had, as a family, we have perfect attendance on showing up whenever the call goes out, because I'm an Iraq vet. And that may have played a role in it for sure. Was, every once in a while I collect a beating for something, and I had to figure out what that meant from somebody that loved me.
We have very, very similar paths, my friend.
Yeah. Sets you up to see the world in a unique way, for sure. Yeah.
Just wait till we get home. Just wait till we get home.
Wait till your father gets home. Yes. Oh, sweet. Can't wait. Love Dad. Yeah. Anyway. So as I reflect on it in the book, to answer your question, the instructions I'd been given about life were very strict evangelical Christian beliefs. And it was like, well, suicide's off the table. That'll send you to hell. And I don't want to get recycled in hell over and over and over again or whatever. So I'd have to make a plan, begin with the end in mind and know that I'm going to die. So how do I want to die? And then back plan everything from 8 years old out from how I want to die. That was the way I was going to figure out how to live. And I decided the best option was to try to be a hero of some kind. Like my grandfather had been a combat medic in World War II. My dad had been a survival school instructor in Vietnam. They were both, heroes in my mind. And it was like, all right, here's the deal. I don't have to worry about getting old and dealing with planning for retirement. If I can just die young and beautiful in some far off land having an adventure or whatever, that would be the best way to go about finding a loophole in this fear of death thing. Was okay, I'm gonna die a heroic death somehow or whatever. And just wound up that, for whatever reason, that fairy tale that I told myself gave me enough comfort to like fall asleep whenever I was 8 years old. It was like, all right, fine, I'll figure out a way to die a hero, and then everything will be okay. I'll die before my parents do, and then I don't have to worry about these older humans like having to depend on them or whatever. And it didn't work out. I failed at that.
It never does.
I didn't die a hero. I'm still here just being a chucklehead, man.
So you're going through life. You're thinking this way, and then you answered the call. So you are an Iraq vet. So tell me about that, because I remember I always knew I was going in the military. So my grandfather, my dad, same thing, Vietnam. Never talked about it though. Now that I'm a little older and I think about that, my dad never talked about Vietnam. We never watched a war movie. My dad was very, very silent about that, and it was always no one needs to know our business. And I do joke because I have an amazing family, very evangelical Christian background as well, but it was very much wait till your father gets home. So when I was old enough, I knew I was going. So I went from boot camp to the Gulf. So, and I remember like getting the call like right after boot camp and watching Desert Shield and knowing what was going on. And I'm like, well, all right, my dad's been there, so it's cool. But I never really equated it to trying to die. I just wanted to do that anyway, and I never really thought about the hell concept. So I figured someday I would just do it, but I never really did. So tell me about that. So you're answering the call.
Yeah, I wanted to join straight out of high school, but I'm colorblind, and that disqualified me from a lot of the like special operations tracks that was what I wanted to try to do. I wanted to be a PJ, a pararescue jumper in the Air Force straight out of high school. I went to sign up and they said, you can't do that, you're colorblind. I said, well, if I can't do what I want, I'm not doing it. And I went to college instead and kind of tried to cobble together a way of still having the same sort of like high adventure life, but I had to kind of figure out how to pay for it myself. Like you sign up in the military, they pay you to exercise, they pay you to shoot guns, they pay you to
blow stuff up,
like run buffers on floors and sweep and do vehicle maintenance, like none of the stuff that's in the commercials, right? It's like 98% boredom, 2% frenetic activity and running for your life, and not even from like an actual threat, but from sergeant major or something like that. Like it's nothing at all like as advertised. But anyway, so I was going to try to sign up for that and wound up going to college at several different colleges because I was a bit of a lost soul. I just didn't know what I wanted out of life at that point. Like I knew I was like, oh man, the plan was to go die a hero, and now I've screwed that up before I even got through the gate. They wouldn't even let me sign up for the job I wanted. Wound up getting a bachelor's degree in outdoor education and intercultural studies with a minor in Swahili. I was traveling the world. I was, picking up contracts, leading mountaineering trips, and did like a little bit of like private military contracting along the way. I was teaching wilderness emergency medicine and, just climbing mountains and having adventures and doing, like living the dream, but like outside of the military as close as you could approximate as a civilian or whatever. And, wound up, it was like I had a whole bunch of plans, fell in love, like that, changed everything, decided to get married, had to figure out how to grow up a little bit more than I was prepared to do at that point, trying to figure out different jobs, and still felt this very strong religious connection, was still a very evangelical Christian. Wound up doing the National Guard route. I signed up as a combat medic because you can be colorblind and just join the regular army, and bought the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer, absolute horseshit lie that the recruiters from the National Guard will sell you. And that was at 27. I was a bit of a late bloomer, probably still am, and signed up then and moved my family, my wife and I, from New York to Louisville, Kentucky, so I could go to seminary at the same time. I was going to I got a Master of Divinity degree along the way. Halfway through finishing that was when I did my trip to Iraq with the military police from the Kentucky Army National Guard down here. And we were some of the last soldiers out of Iraq. They like to say that we turned the lights out. Everybody was gone. The place was a ghost town, and we were still there. Like, hey, when's our flight, man? Like, what's the deal? Like, I feel like the Iraqis are just gonna like start milling around in here, and there's not anything we're gonna do to prevent it because there's like 100 of us left or whatever, you know. I handed off a bunch of my stuff to guys like from the Department of Homeland Security because nobody from DOD was left whenever we finally did get on a flight out of there. Yeah, it got a little hectic and hairy there at the end, and there's like one story I tell in the book that I don't love. I still don't love talking about. It's pretty crazy, some of the stuff that happened to me. Anyway, but yeah, we were some of the last troops out of Iraq at the end there, and nothing was like when you were 8 years old and you imagined what your life was going to be like, and especially after coming back from that one. I was pretty fucked up at that point. Like some of the things that I saw or had to participate in, all of it was like, none of this is that little kid's dream of being a hero. And, you know, I really didn't. I went through a real dark period after getting back from there. A lot of drinking. It was a lot like maybe, you know, your description of your dad, where it was how did tough guys handle all of this stuff? We don't talk about it and we drink about it, and then we just, you know, die young from the consequences of living that way, whether it's a, you know, drunk driving accident or just developing liver cirrhosis bad enough that it gets you young or whatever it might be.
Or you know, sometimes it's even worse because sometimes you're just alive but dead. And I feel like that's kind of what had happened to me. So I came home and I didn't really drink a whole lot, but didn't live either.
Yeah.
And there was a point where my wife actually said a few years ago, like, I love you, but I don't love you anymore. You don't love yourself, and you need to kind of figure this all out. So
yeah, I was in a real dark place for about a decade where I was just kind of a shell in a bunch of ways. I was angry. I think that was like would have been the defining characteristic at that point in my life, was just anger all the time underneath. You know, I wasn't processing any of what I'd been through as a kid, wasn't processing anything. The way I described it was like I felt like I had run through a minefield for about 30 years and stuff was just blowing up all the time. It was like Wile E. Coyote. Like if I don't look down and see exactly how bloody and battered I am, I'll bleed out and I'll collapse and I can just die without ever looking at any of it, right? And I wasn't allowed to do that. I wound up, you know, having to go and take a look at and render some self-aid and some buddy aid and make some connections where I wound up, I guess to rewind a little, during that period of time, I also was an okay enough combat medic that I got selected to go to the inter-service physician assistant program in the military, which is one of the best kept secrets out there as far as a military opportunity goes. Like I got paid staff sergeant pay to go to graduate school to get a medical license to practice medicine. Like,
wow.
No debt for that. Most of my civilian counterparts are six figures in debt to get an education like that. And I got paid to go to school to do it. Now, granted, it's a military school, so it's going to be done 1,000 miles an hour and confusing at the same time. It's going to be like, you got a final exam on Friday morning. Also, 4:30 in the morning, we're going on a 5-mile fun run around the upper parade ground. And hey, because it's Halloween, you can wear a Halloween costume for, you know, motivation or whatever. It's like, no, man, I want to cram. I want to study for this exam.
Wow.
You know? Just silly little games that the military plays with everybody as part of the deal or whatever.
But it makes you such a better person.
You can certainly endure.
I do laugh about it though, because I think when I was active duty first, and then I got out, went to college, and went back in the reserves for 8 years. And very similar to you, I thought, this is it. Like, this is a reserve. Like, reserves are it. These people are all going to get me killed. Like, I mean, they'd never been to combat. They'd never been on a ship. And I was reporting to some of them, and it was like, I would have to kill them first, because at the end of the day,
I wouldn't follow you out of a burning building, much less into a firefight. Was how I felt,
so being in the Navy, I did sea first, and then I did Seabees second. So I did all ground, Green Navy after that. But yeah, like doing 203 grenade launch. I mean, being able to draw a fire plan. None of these people had ever done it or seen it.
Yeah.
So it was. But I found when I got out, civilian world was easy for me to succeed. Because in the military, you had to cram at 4:30 run and do all the stuff. And here I'm like, wow, man, these people really don't do a whole lot of anything. They really don't stand for anything.
I was pretty fortunate, I think. Like, the level of experience varies for sure across the military in general, particularly the reserve components. The units that I've been in the Kentucky National Guard have managed to be very experienced people in
That's
leadership
awesome.
positions there. Like the unit that I went to Iraq with, there were guys there who had deployed 3, 4, 5 times with the regular army before joining the National Guard.
Combat
So just
ready.
yeah, I made staff sergeant like overnight, which was too fast, and had a whole bunch of responsibility. I was a platoon sergeant, I was running a bunch of stuff, and I didn't know what I was doing. But there were guys there who I could look up to, and they were like, "Hey, we recognize that you don't know what you're doing, but you're a good dude. We'll help you out. We'll
Oh
figure some
wow,
of this
that's
stuff out."
amazing.
So I
That's
was
amazing.
pretty fortunate as far as that goes to have. I repeatedly stumbled headlong into finding really good mentors along the way somehow. It's maybe the only gift that I have is like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. Does anybody? Okay. I don't mind to point out that I'm screwing up and
Well, you're
somebody will
ahead of
come
the curve
along
because most
and
people
show me,
don't. Whereas we just
Yeah.
try to hide it and like
Right.
fake it. So
Yeah. I figure everybody can tell anyway, like I'm big enough and ugly enough. Everybody's watching this guy fuck up over and over again anyway. I might as well just call myself out for it. But so in physician assistant school, I felt like I was kind of getting a chance to make some career move. I'd kind of cobbled together this life the whole way along where I was like, I'm going to have adventures and die young. And that's not a great way to like then get married and raise children and, just not the headspace you need to be in to be a good husband and a good father. And I did well in the PA program and, like finished near the top of my class of the first phase and at the top of the class of the second phase. But I had this pretty significant emotional event during the second phase where a friend of mine died by suicide in the unit that I had come from. He and I had worked together. He'd been the executive officer of a unit where I was in the active duty component of the National Guard, the AGR program for a while. And he was just a really good guy, like a really great soldier, a good leader. It's hard. Like there's people who fall off the horse one side of the other where they're like a real hard leader and you can't come to them with a problem that they aren't going to smash you for. And then there's the kind of softer, touchier, feelier side where you can come to somebody if you got a problem, but like they don't know how to solve it. He was like a good leader. He was capable of both, right? Like he could be mom and dad if you needed it or whatever. And he had his own demons and his own issues and whatever. They became too much for him. He decided to call it quits. And
did you know? I mean, did you see any signs?
I mean, I hadn't seen him. I was gone for a year and a half. It had been a year and a half or so since I'd seen him because I was in the first phase of the IPAP program. Is 16 months long, and we'd moved away a couple months before that. Okay. So, I mean, the last time I saw him was like during a training exercise. He'd cut his finger, and I bandaged up his finger. I kind of mentioned him in one of the later chapters in my book, kind of the anti-suicide chapter in the book. This friend of mine, and I got the news from a friend of ours that just called me up and said, "Hey, man, Travis, took his life, and just figured you'd want to know." And it's like a lot of things. You don't have the opportunity to grieve it appropriately at the time because I'm in the middle of like my emergency medicine rotation in PA school, which is just round the clock. You're in the ER, seeing patients and trying to get ready for that big exam at the end of it. You got to pass, like life is just study and work the whole way through that, 29-month program. So I got up early the next day, went into the emergency room, and right away was confronted by an intentional overdose. This beautiful young lady decided she didn't want to be on the planet anymore. And, I knew what to do in an emergency medicine context there. Like, I was part of the team that intubated her and stabilized her respirations and, tried to figure out what she was on and got her into the intensive care unit, admitted to the hospital and all of those sorts of things. But I know that the prognosis isn't great after both, physiologically, and whenever you ingest a large amount of, medicines that can stop your breathing, there's some, potential for problems with your brain after that going forward. Just the process of being innovated and living on a vent is a high risk sort of thing. Then psychologically, after an initial attempt, the prognosis is also not good. A lot of people will try again after that. And just being confronted right in front of my own face by the same problem that had taken my friend's life recently, was jarring for me. And then because I had the Master of Divinity degree already, I pulled like a little Jedi mind trick on the chief of the emergency room and said, "Hey, I want to go with the chaplain and I want to sit with the family and see if there's some good that I could do there too." And I don't even know like what was going on in my head to like try to do that, but I just wanted to care for the people that were near to this lady. Like I wanted to participate in more than just her care. And I walked into the room where her husband and her little girl were, like her daughter was my daughter's age. Like he could have been me. This could have been like, it was like looking in a mirror, and it broke me, man. It broke my heart. Like I'm choking up a little bit just remembering it right now. And, I like being confronted with it at that moment, like I sat down with the guy and just spent some time with him trying to like just commiserate and listen and be available and
Hold space.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think like he's a young NCO from out of like the 101st or something like that. He's not used to somebody caring about what's going on with him, right? And I think that was impactful nonetheless. And in any event, I said, I had planned on going into like some kind of emergency medicine or primary care or whatever. I'm a bit of adrenaline junkie. And being confronted with that stuff, I decided like right then and there, I want to go into mental health. I want to do something about this. I don't understand it well enough from a medical perspective to feel like I could do much, but I feel like I'm familiar with that headspace. I understand what it's like to not want to be here anymore. A little bit, like a lot of people who go into mental health are trying to figure out what's wrong with them just as much as anybody else. Like I think everybody's got to admit they're a little guilty of that to some extent anyway.
Well, as you're talking about that though, so I never really even talked or even processed until now. I had a friend so I used to do Ironman distance triathlons, and I would do anything I could to feel pain, because I didn't feel anything. And I had a friend who was a Marine, and I would run with him all the time. We would do Ironmans and things together. He owned a running store, and I got a call from one of our friends. He had hung himself in the store.
Wow.
And that's why I was asking, did you know? Because I ran with him the week before, and never saw signs.
And that's what everybody said close to Travis too, was like,
So I would go through text messages for like 6 months. Like, how did I miss it? Like, you just do because you hide it.
And I get what you're saying about pain too. Like, are you familiar with the Murph workout from CrossFit, the Hero WOD, 1 mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, 1 mile run with a weight vest on? During PA school, I did what I call the Murphathon. I ran 24.2 miles and then did a Murph immediately afterwards just to feel something, I ran a Spartan ultra marathon on one weekend between, we had an OBGYN exam on a Friday and a hematology oncology exam on a Monday. And I ran this stupid race for like 9 hours on a Saturday and spent all day Sunday in an ice bath trying to recover from it. Like just stupid stuff. Like, why am I doing this to myself?
I ran ultra marathons for 10 years after Ironmans. And then I ran my last 100 last year and said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore.
It's not like everybody's like this, but if I'm being honest, for me, when I was doing a lot of that, it was very self-destructive. I was in this self-destructive headspace, didn't like myself, didn't have much self-worth, wanted to destroy myself, but wasn't willing to go the whole way. So, hey, let's do, Linda from CrossFit or something as hard as we can, and then just lay on the ground. And now I have a reason to cry, and nobody can blame me for it.
In hindsight, it's fun because I used to tell people that I wanted to see what I was made of, but in reality, I really wanted to feel, because I couldn't feel anything.
100%. So
now you're in this. You're going down this direction of mental health.
So managed to get a job straight out of school in a psychiatry private practice. A friend of mine from church was a psychiatrist, and he offered me a job. Has been a great, friend and mentor to me, Dr. Bob Stewart, here in Louisville, Kentucky. And he was already doing ketamine infusions out of his outpatient office. He started doing that in, I think, like 2017, which is pretty cutting edge.
Very cutting edge.
He's an older guy and always stayed right on the cutting edge of the research that came out and was available, and was trying to do the most good for the most people that he possibly could. Just a wonderful man and physician. And he hired me and was teaching me and training me a bunch. And that would have been, I passed the board exams in February of 2020 and got my medical license. And everybody remembers March of 2020 was when the world shut down because of COVID, right?
Yep.
Which is a super weird time to be starting a medical career. And I wound up, there was a lot of uncertainty about hospitalizing people. So we wound up having people who were pretty acutely suicidal that we would try to manage outpatient using ketamine as a piece of the treatment approach that normally maybe you'd want to put on a 72-hour hold or tried to put into the hospital. It was, questionable. So wound up getting kind of a baptism by fire in a bunch of ways, dealing with that. And still wasn't in a great headspace myself at that point either. Very stressed, still drinking a lot behind the scenes. I'm helping a whole bunch of people with this psychedelic medicine, ketamine, and seeing all these great outcomes, and not really thinking like, hey, maybe this is something that I would benefit from.
It's
too.
Typical for people in the medical space. Great caregivers, horrible caretakers.
I'm just standing there bleeding all over this person. Like, hey man, that blood's getting in my eyes. Could you apply some pressure, put a bandage on that or whatever?
I'll just keep working.
No, I'm good. I got you. Don't worry. Silly. Anyway, so about the time I started to get some traction in that role, getting a big enough caseload that contributing to the practice and stuff, I got a notification of sourcing that my National Guard unit was going to deploy to Europe, over to Kosovo. I was going to be the, battalion PA for an infantry battalion that was going over there. So got the carpet kind of yanked out from under me a bunch of times along the way in my life. And one more time, here we go. Thanks, Uncle Sam. Shut down, I handed off my part of the practice to another PA who's still there doing a wonderful job, and had to go over to Europe, say goodbye to my family again. It was just really, deployments are difficult regardless of, what the content of that deployment winds up being, if it's highly kinetic or highly not. Just the process is traumatic on families for sure. And actually that was when I got fully sober, was starting on that deployment. I had a couple buddies who were like, hey, we want to quit drinking. You want to quit drinking with us? They didn't know that I was, having a problem at that point. They were kind of asking me to be the one to hold them accountable. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, actually. So quit drinking on this deployment to Kosovo. It was best, after about, 4 or 5 months, I got real clear headed. I was like, hey, this is not great. I've been living in a horrible way, and wound up, getting sober minded on this deployment, and then coming home and connected with some folks that gave me the opportunity to do some ketamine assisted therapy for myself. And then the employer there also sent me to the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, training to do MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. It was one of the last cohorts that they ran in October of 2022. So now I get to say that I was one of the last soldiers out of Iraq and one of the first soldiers trained to do MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD in this sort of weird psychedelic Forrest Gump sort of way that I wind up being in important rooms, if not being an important person anyway.
So tell me about that. So ketamine assisted therapy. You hear a lot about it. You hear a lot of misinformation on that. We'll set MDMA aside. Super passionate about both because I think that's where most of my healing came from. And I was really involved at the federal level this summer. I got to be able to go and share my story with senators and congressmen, and that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
But ketamine, what is it?
Yeah, so ketamine is an FDA-approved anesthetic. It's on the World Health Organization's essential medicines list because it is one of the safest anesthetic medicines that we've been able to develop in medicine so far. It has very little impact on the cardiorespiratory drive and allows somebody to go to sleep and have their appendix removed and not really notice it in as safe a way as we're able to do that. Older versions of anesthesia were usually affected somebody's respiratory drive, and ketamine does not. So, my initial experience with it in training was as a combat medic. They said, "Hey, low doses of this medicine can be a pain reliever." And then high doses is the night button. If somebody's still whining a whole bunch after you give them the pain relieving dose, you can turn it up to 11 and knock them out, and then you don't have to listen to them whine anymore. Was kind of the way that they trained us on it. But there's been a building body of literature since about 1999, 2000, Yale University, Yale Medical School published some data around using what they called sub-anesthetic doses of ketamine. There's this window of dosing between real low and real high where there seem to be significant improvements very rapidly in both suicidal intent and depression. And now there's been, almost 25 years of growing data around its use for anxiety and substance use disorders and post-traumatic stress and a whole, range of mental health conditions where it seems that ketamine can act very rapidly compared with treatment as usual with SSRI or SSRI plus augmentation with a second generation antipsychotic, or, there's a bunch of ways that we mix and match pharmacology and psychiatry that is evidence-based, but does move slowly. It's start low, go slow. You're going to feel better in weeks or months potentially, where ketamine can have people feeling better in hours and days. All the literature and now my experience as a clinician suggests that it should have a much earlier role in the treatment algorithm for people who are struggling.
How does that work though? So I know there's several different kinds. I mean, there's because I see advertisements on Facebook, so I can take a pill at home. I can use Bravado, which I'm seeing commercials. I can take a IV. Like, how do they all work?
Yeah, it's all the same molecule, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier and does more or less the same thing. There are multiple routes of delivery. There are companies that will connect people with a clinician who will prescribe an at-home oral version, whether it's a syrup or a lozenge or a troche or some of those sorts of things. But I don't participate in that, partly because I don't like the level of liability associated with like telehealth providing somebody a psychedelic medicine. There are people who are comfortable with that, and I don't throw any shade on them, but for my own professional level of risk tolerance, I don't do that. And I also think that the oral delivery route of this particular medicine, the first pass metabolism in the liver, you have to have remarkably high amounts of an oral dose of ketamine to create that effect, the desired effect, in terms of giving somebody a mildly psychedelic dreamlike experience, as well as all of the neurological benefits that have been demonstrated in preclinical models where you're increasing growth factors in the brain and essentially healing the loss of density in certain locations that are associated with chronic stress states. I also don't like, ketamine is, if you read between the lines on the medical literature, it's a quote unquote rapid acting antidepressant. What does that mean? It's fun. People enjoy their ketamine journeys or experiences pretty often, and just mailing somebody a large amount of it to have on the shelf is potential for diversion, potential for abuse is much higher than if someone has to come into an office and be supervised whenever they're receiving that medicine, which is how I approach it in my clinic here in Louisville, Kentucky. Is I do intramuscular injections for a few reasons we could get into if you're interested. And then you'd also mention...
I actually am very interested, and I know that the audience that listens to this is definitely going to be interested as well. And I mean, as we're talking about it, so I have I've talked about this before. I have a couple of friends that searching, and I know that when I was searching for, and I didn't even know I was searching at the time for healing, I started asking all these questions, and there was just all this information and misinformation
Sure.
which is why I really wanted to create the show. I wanted to be able to create a place where we just had a conversation, good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah.
Because I had lots, and I met with a guy who actually heard us speak a few months ago in May, and he approached me, and I shared the story, I think, on LinkedIn, and he was part of a clinical trial, and they told him that he had 6 months where he wouldn't feel those symptoms anymore. And we sat down over breakfast, and he said, I don't want to go back to feeling that way. And I know
Right.
that if it's a 6 to 12 month window, I have to do something. And I was like, wow, I'm like, what are you asking me to do? As a facilitator and your friend, I really can't do anything for you because we're too close.
Yeah.
And then I started steering him to other resources. But then that's where I got the idea. Like, I want to be able to have these conversations for people who don't know what to do, where to go.
Sure.
So, and I don't know a whole lot about. I know my own journey with ketamine, but I don't know how all of it works. So yeah, so intramuscular.
Yeah. So I like doing it that way based on the level of experience I developed doing it IV previously. IV winds up being considered kind of a gold standard because you have 100% bioavailability. You are putting the medicine directly into the circulatory system, which is where we're measuring it. So 100% goes in, that's 100%. That's what everything else gets measured against, right? Orally, depending on some of the enzymatic pathways in your liver, the amount that you put in your mouth that actually crosses over into your brain, it could be as low as like 19 or 20%. It could be as high as 70%. There's a lot of factors that play into figuring out uniquely personalized to you how much is getting through, right? Spravato is the brand only, Johnson & Johnson produced inhalational version of S-ketamine. Every, organic chemistry major out there will recognize that a chemical molecule has a right hand and a left hand. There's the R enantiomer and the S enantiomer. So S-ketamine as opposed to R-ketamine is the only thing that's in Spravato. And why they pick that, S-ketamine has a much higher binding affinity for a particular receptor site in the brain called the NMDA, N-methyl D-aspartate receptor, which has been the target of a lot of research around, hey, is this how ketamine works in mental health? And it seems like it's a prime mover, but may not be the whole picture. Not to go too far down like a research nerd rabbit hole here and stay on topic of the question. In any event, Spravato is a fixed dose. So it's inhalational. You're spraying it in your own nose in a doctor's office, and it only goes so high. And the dosing, IV or IM of ketamine, is all weight-based. So it's a percentage. It's a range of medicine based on how much somebody weighs that we dose them with. So there's the potential to give somebody much higher doses with IV or IM than is available with Spravato. A lot of clinics will offer Spravato as almost just an on-ramp to try to bring them in to bring patients in who might not have been willing to come see them for an IV or IM medicine because of insurance questions or costs. It's, hey, come try Spravato because it'll be covered by your insurance and you won't have to pay as much out of pocket. And then whenever it only works a little bit for you because the dose is so low, let me try to talk you into taking, a higher dose.
That's very interesting because I was reading a poll, and I think 9% of ketamine clinics actually say Spravato works. So it was like it's super low, and the only reason that they prescribe it, I think the number was like 61% prescribe it because it's covered by insurance.
Yep, people will come in and they'll do that, and then they'll find out, hey, maybe there's a better way, and it's just a way of getting the conversation going for a percentage of people who wouldn't have gotten all the way into receiving what is a sufficient dose. And I won't go off on the tangent about the way that the clinical trials were run with Spravato, where they had to have 3 clinical trials approved by the FDA, and the third one failed to separate from placebo until after some post hoc analyses were done.
And I was actually
what kind of deal got made to make that happen in the first place that MAPS failed to do to get MDMA
I was
across
actually
the
just
finish
going to bring it up. So
line?
I was on a networking conversation last night. We were kind of joking because one of the AdCom off voting members was Janssen Pharmaceuticals, the maker of Spravato. So it was just kind of an interesting.
Yeah.
Not that I'm a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah,
but
no, yeah.
that was
Nobody
the
ever
first
makes
thing that I
conspiracies
noticed
at all.
during the because I sat for the entire thing, and that was the first thing that I had posted to my team. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, why is this person on? Well, they're a non-voting member. So
yeah. in any event, Spravato does have the FDA-approved indication for depression with suicidality. It's, the first time that a medicine's been approved for something like that in decades. So there is sufficient evidence in the FDA's mind for ketamine to be useful in that application. And the idea that there's something magical about it being a brand-only medication that is only as ketamine is somehow radically distinct from racemic ketamine, a combination of R and S ketamine, makes no scientific sense whatsoever. So you're getting something very similar, and in an IV or an IM formulation, right? Nobody's doing it per rectum that I know of at this point, but there are ways of delivering medicine, out there. Anywhere you have a mucous membrane, you can absorb a medicine.
I guess I never thought about it like that, but yeah.
So laying that one aside, an intramuscular injection gives about 93% compared with the 100% of IV. So you can just do the math and increase the dose slightly and give somebody the same amount of medicine crossing the blood-brain barrier as doing it IV. And you don't have a lot of the what I call IV anxiety issues that I experienced whenever I was running this. When in my practice, I was doing IV only because that's a pretty standard practice in a lot of clinics. You do have people who are hard sticks. You have people who aren't hard sticks, but sure believe they are. Like there's an anxiety component to a lot of the conditions that people are coming to see me for in the first place that gets turned up to 11 whenever there's a question of, are we going to get the IV on the first try or not? And then even if we do, they're hooked up to an IV pole, and there's a lot of anxiety about accidentally removing a catheter, or sometimes people, they want to move around whenever they're getting a ketamine experience. They're waving their arms, they're, moving in the chair, whatever the case might be, and they dislodge it. And by giving, you can, divide doses. And if you understand how, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics work, you can dose intramuscularly in a way that creates the same area under the curve type experience as an IV dosing session, but with, just a couple injections instead of all of the goofing around with an IV in the first place. So once I got experienced enough and talked to some other people who'd been doing this longer than me, who all were saying, yeah, we stopped doing it IV, we do it IM only now for all of these sorts of reasons. I said, wow, that's really smart. I'm just going to keep doing it that way from now on. So there's a lot of people who get, a lot of clients I see who've only done it one way before, and people just get attracted and drawn to the way that they've always done it. But when I explain it to them that way, you're Bluetooth hands free if we do this IM instead of IV, after the initial experience, they're like, yeah, this makes perfect sense.
Wow, that's a really good analogy that I never even considered. So it's Bluetooth.
So. Yeah.
So walk me through, like, what does that look like? So I come see you. I have all these issues that I've had for years, and then I doc you and I sit down, and what can I expect?
We do an initial psychiatric diagnostic evaluation, which wouldn't be that different from any other psychiatrist office that you would go see. We sit down for an hour to an hour and a half, and we just go through your medical and mental health history. And at the end of that, I make treatment recommendations. Okay. It just happens to be that I'm familiar enough with and offer ketamine as one of the tools in the tool belt that I have that a lot of people wind up coming to see me for in the first place. But I also prescribe medications whenever it's appropriate. I also do just talk therapy whenever it's appropriate. I do, what I call performance mindset coaching as well. There are people who come to see me who are very acutely suicidal, and there are people who come to see me who are professional athletes and CEOs. And, there's a lot of the same sort of tool sets available, just oriented towards the particular problems that somebody's having that can help somebody who's in that left tail of the bell curve and doesn't want to be here anymore to get back into, the middle to right half of the bell curve feeling pretty good. And then people who are in the top 3% that want to be in the top 1%, a lot of the same, conversations just oriented towards, problem solution finding. It winds up being what I do a lot of the time. So in any event, we spend an hour and a half talking and figuring out what's going on with you. And then I make whatever recommendations professionally I think are appropriate. And that doesn't always mean ketamine, and it doesn't always mean working with me either. I'll refer people out all the time where I say, hey, I think you should go down the street and talk to my friends that do transcranial magnetic stimulation. I think that would actually work much better for you given exactly what you're presenting with. Or, hey, you've tried some of this stuff already. Like, we need to go a different route altogether. And I try to be as holistic as possible. There's a lot of developing research in the area of what's called metabolic psychiatry, where diet and exercise and sleep and all the things that you'll hear about on the Huberman Lab podcast and the Peter Attia Drive and all of those great podcasts, I try to incorporate as meaningfully into things as possible. And over again, I wind up using ketamine as a way to help somebody get a reset and get a break period here. The way that I also do it a lot of the time is that's distinct whenever I decide, yes, ketamine assisted therapy would be appropriate for you, is I do the induction over a 6-week period of time rather than over 2 or 3 weeks. A lot of clinics, based on the clinical trials, which were usually run in 2 or 3 weeks' time, will do an induction phase where you come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 2 weeks and you get 6 ketamine infusions. It's pretty standard in the industry.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and that's why I don't do it that way. Is I did it that way for a while, and it winds up being somebody needing to take 2 weeks off of work, and the amount of disruption to their life in order to get this treatment. If some of them were lucky to break even on it, yeah, I feel a whole lot better, but now I'm 2 weeks behind at work, and I've checked out of my family for a while, and like, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, doc. I don't know if this helped me or not, all things considered.
Right.
So instead, I'll do a ketamine medicine session on a particular day, and then a day or two later, we'll do what I call an integration session, which is a ketamine-used version of the MDMA protocols that MAPS developed for, combining preparation and medicine and integration therapy in a cycle. And I see a lot better outcomes whenever ketamine's combined with therapy, and we're doing the work of trying to figure out what's going on with somebody and the changes that they need to make in order to start to improve their lives, and they get the support and the care and the accountability associated with a therapy relationship. And spreading it out across 6 weeks is less disruptive to most people's lives. They only have to take a few hours off of work each week rather than, an extensive amount. And also all of the research around habit change and changing, like James Duhigg's famous book on the power of habit, everything suggests somewhere between 30 and 45 days of not doing one thing and starting to do something else instead is how you change habits. And by allowing somebody to take 6 weeks worth of time to constantly be working on changing some of the habits of thinking, emoting, relating, and behaving, they wind up sticking a whole lot more thoroughly, so that they have to come back to see me less often for maintenance ketamine therapy than in a lot of other places. And they, like, over and over again, like, the success stories that I see are amazing. It's not like this is a magic bullet and everybody gets better, but I'd say it's way north of 80% in my practice, where people are far better off than they were whenever they came in. There's people who I see who've been on a fistful of meds for 30 or 40 years, who we at least get them down to something more like rational polypharmacy, where they're on just 1 or 2 meds, or sometimes they, a trial of coming all the way off. I taper people off of benzos. I taper people off of Ambien and other Z drugs at night during that period of time, because they know that they're being well supported in terms of the ketamine doing what it's going to do in terms of upregulating growth factors, growing new neurons, being anti-inflammatory, and all of the dark thoughts go quiet for a lot of people. The anti-suicidal properties of ketamine are very valuable in that regard. At the end of the 6 weeks, a lot of people I wind up just handing off to a maintenance therapist. Like, hey, here's a great therapist that I think you would gel well with. Like, I'm just doing whatever I think is best for that person in front of me, and maybe that's not always the best thing for my bottom line as a clinic or whatever.
I was just thinking, wow,
what's the lifetime value on
the
this? The
anti-hero became the hero. So what would I expect? Like, so I'm thinking, like, so many different things in ketamine treatment. Like, I come in, I sit into a chair. I'm immediately thinking psychedelic experiences. I'm going to see all kinds of Mandelas, and is it like that? Is it not like that?
Yeah. So, ketamine is unique in a bunch of ways, right? You have your classical psychedelics, which are, the way I explain it to people in the clinic is like, ketamine is much more like a dream experience, whereas, a high dose of LSD or mushrooms, if the wall wants to talk to you, you're going to listen to every damn word the wall has to say. With ketamine, if you're not having a good time, you can take off the eye mask and the headphones, and you can see that you're sitting in my office and not off in the ninth dimension or whatever place you're visiting, or
I was thinking
whatever
of my
past life
DMT. My
regression
DMT
or whatever.
experience was like the ninth dimension.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. There's no machine elves. You don't see the
right.
the zero with 1,000 faces, as I call it. The the nothing behind everything or whatever. You come in for a medicine session, a ketamine session, and in my office, there's a zero gravity recliner. There's eye shades. It's a relaxed, comfortable setting. It's not very clinical. It's much more like a therapist's office. It's comfortable. There's a couch there if you have a loved one that you want them to sit with you, or I stay with the person the whole time. I use Wave Paths, is an app that's been developed specifically for psychedelic assisted therapy, where the music is curated to the substance, the dose, and the duration is the claim that they make. I haven't, I'm still a captain in the Army National Guard, so I'm not a very experienced psychonaut myself in that regard. So I don't know how well Wave Paths works for that, but I do know my clients do find it very valuable for the ketamine use in any event. So that we do a medical check-in, you get yourself relaxed, we do some intention setting around what's the reason that you're doing this, what are the ways that you need to approach thinking about it going into it. I give somebody the medicine, they listen to music, usually the quote-unquote non-ordinary state of consciousness, the ketamine dream state. Lasts for 40, 45 minutes, sometimes closer to an hour. It just varies from person to person. And then we do a little bit of therapy on the back end as well, just kind of getting your land legs back under you there, sailor, and getting you ready to, go back out into the world. And I call it stealing fire from the gods. You go over into some other space inside yourself or inside the universe, or however you think about it, or it's meaningful to you, to find some answers, and then you come back here and you integrate that meaningfully into your day-to-day life, trapped here in the third dimension on this prison planet, or however you like to think about life on Earth.
As you were talking about this, I have a really good friend who just recently started ketamine treatment, and known him forever. And he called me after the fourth one, and he was like crying. And said, I get it now.
Yeah.
I understand this transformation you've had, and why you're going the direction that you are. So
Yeah.
is that a typical?
There are what I call two phenotypes of treatment responders. There are people for whom this isn't, it's a small percentage, but there are people for whom it doesn't work as well as we'd hope. Virtually everybody that I see is better after the 6 weeks than they were whenever they came in, but the amount we try to measure with some, subjective scales, PHQ-9 and GAD-7 and PCL-5 and some of those sorts of things. Try to be as objective in measuring it as possible. What I'm shooting for is everybody to be at least twice as well off. Those scores to be cut in half is what we call treatment response. Okay. And then there are people who go into quote unquote treatment remission, where they no longer meet diagnostic criteria. Their depression is effectively gone at the end of the 6 weeks. And again, it's way over half of the people that I see that are in remission, and north of 80% that are treatment responders, I would say. And then there's that percentage that don't respond. Among the responders and the remitters, there seem to be kind of two phenotypes with ketamine. One is what I call an accumulation. Over the 6 weeks that they're working with me, there's no breakthrough moment. They don't have a significant emotional event along the way, but each week they can see, and their loved ones can see, they're getting better. And by the end of 6 weeks, they say, wow, I don't know when exactly it happened, but I am sleeping better. I am making, better food choices. I'm able to exercise. I'm back to work. I'm cleaning. I'm, reading for joy again. I listened to music and dance the other day, a bunch of those sorts of things. When did it start? When did it happen? I'm not even sure, but boy, I'm sure glad I did this. The other one is somebody who has a significant emotional event or multiple significant emotional events along the way, where in that ketamine dream space, they revisit a traumatic memory from a place of courage and compassion rather than overwhelm and pain and being triggered, or they have a conversation with God or an ancestor or an angel or a loved one or some very psychedelic experience that is so emotionally meaningful to them that they then have a breakthrough in therapy. Oh, that's why I've been drinking. I haven't been dealing with X, Y, and Z. They deal with X, Y, and Z, and they don't even feel the urge to drink anymore or to lose their temper or to whatever the case may be. So there's kind of these two ways that I see people getting better. One is just sort of gradually things got better, and I don't know when it happened. And the other one is, boy, that third session was insane, and I'm so glad that I had that experience.
I was just I read a study, I think it was yesterday. Actually, I was quoted in a article that Healing Maps did about executives and CEOs who blow up their lives, so to speak, after a psychedelic experience. And I feel like I'm trying to remember, I think it was like 71% of executives and CEOs say that their lives changed dramatically after their psychedelic experiences.
Sure.
What you're describing very similarly sound like mine. So we were kind of joking about our 8-year-old selves. In my first experience, I actually saw, and I shared this in my book, I was 4 years old. I saw a fight between my mom and my dad. And I had no idea that shaped my entire life thought process about success. And I just kept moving the needle because I didn't want that to happen to me. And when I confronted that, it was so different. Like things became more about the have what matters lifestyle than the have or chase everything that you have to, because I think we have this lie here in Western culture to have it all. And I think there comes a point where you have what matters.
Yeah. You have enough.
Yeah. That 8-year-old conversation with my son in the morning is more important to me. We're cold plunging today. So it was just so I cold plunge every morning, and he rode the bike next to me while I was running.
Nice.
Then we went outside and I cold plunged at 48 degrees for 4 minutes. And then he got in and I'm laughing and I'm videoing him because this is so beautiful to watch.
Nice. Yeah, that's good stuff.
I said that to him. I said, we're in a point now where we have what matters. So, and family is what matters.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a beautiful thing. I can only trick my kids into doing some of the crazy stuff I like to do, like 1 or 2 times, and then they're like, "Nah, I'm not doing that again. That was too."
My daughter
cold,
would never do it. My son, he watched me he watched me basically melt down at my 100 last year. It's at altitude Zion National Park. I'm literally dying. I ended up in the medical tent at like mile 42.
Oh no!
It's like the same place I always die at that same race. So mile 42, never finish. It's been like 2 times I've not been able to finish that particular race, but he has watched me, succeed, and he's watched me fail, which at the end of the day, I think that's what life is.
Okay. Yeah.
So what now? I mean, you have this practice. Mm-hmm. You're now, whether you want to admit it or not, the anti-hero became the hero. So what now?
It's tough to escape that hero's journey cycle seems to be woven into the fabric of our universe at this particular juncture.
But I feel like you have learned, though, that you're not the only hero in your journey, which I think is the problem most of us have, is that we think we're the only hero in the journey.
Yeah.
And I know just from knowing you that I don't get that from you.
Well, there's the dark side, right? Whether, we're talking Star Wars or like real life, there's that shadow work, as Carl Jung talked about it. And that's an important piece of psychedelic assisted therapy, is there's this whole range of what it is to be human, all the way from, Mother Teresa on one end to, a terrorist who's hell-bent on the destruction of an enemy civilization on the other end of things. And we have to acknowledge that exists in seed form in all of us. And what are we going to do about that is what I call the anti-hero's journey. The hero's journey, from Joseph Campbell, is something I was very interested in, because that was something that was important for me to figure out how to, find my way in the world as being younger. But I think like the hero's journey to some extent is a wonderful children's story. I think when you're ready to grow up, then it's time to go on the anti-hero's journey. And the perspective on it winds up being like, um, I've listened to Jordan Peterson talk about like telling his kid whenever something scary's happening in a movie, watch what the hero's doing, pay attention to the hero. That's, you'll learn what to do in those situations, and you can see if you're scared in that setting, look at the hero, see what the hero's doing, be like the hero. And there's value in that whenever you're younger. But there's another way of looking at a story, right? The stories are valuable. All of these mythologies that Joseph Campbell's drawing on to talk about what the hero's journey in the first place is pointing at archetypes or things that are inside of all of us in the first place. And you can look at just the hero in the story and try to be like the hero. Whenever you're a kid, that's valuable. It teaches you to be good, to be courageous, to be caring, to be generous, to sacrifice. All of those things are valuable. But then you have to recognize that there's a villain inside of you too. There's a victim waiting there to complain about everything. There's a bystander who's just not going to do shit no matter how bad stuff's happening in front of them, right? Like all of those are roles that you at some point may embody. And even if you don't fully embody them, they're there. They're an aspect of who you are, right? So you can watch a story and recognize that the story is written in a way that there's the hero at the center of every one of them, sure, but that every other character exists inside of you and is intended in the telling of that story to get you to reflect on who you are. The classic examples like the Dark Knight trilogy, right? The interactions between Batman and the Joker, Batman and Bane, as a hero's journey just aren't as valuable as an anti-hero's journey, as recognizing that there's an aspect of me that strongly resembles the villain in those storylines. And how do you make space for that in a way that doesn't try to destroy everything? How do you acknowledge that there is good and evil at the heart of every person out there? And how do we make space at the table for that to be brought into society in a way that isn't promoting violence in the streets and the wars overseas and all of those sorts of things? I think there's a way to get there. I think we have the capacity for integration, for integrating that. And that's what I call the anti-hero's journey, is bringing together the heroic and the villainous aspects of what it is to be a person in the first place, is to recognize that life is far more complex and complicated than just a children's story, and that each one of us needs to, by integrating all of those things, be the anti-hero rather than the hero of our own stories.
That was so beautiful, because it's so true. I mean, within everyone, we have these moments of peace and we have these moments of storm. And it's what we do in those. I'm listening to a book right now. And I don't know if you probably have Neil Donald Walsh, Conversations with God. This average guy just has these conversations and he starts writing it all down. And it's interesting when you think about what good and bad or right and wrong are. They come from someone else's version of right and wrong. I mean, if you go back in history far enough, there really only there is no good or bad in the context of what we think it is, because that comes from someone else's version. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting perspective, because when you're able to give your permission, which sounds like you're giving yourself permission to look at the not so good inside of you and to understand what it is, so that you can bring about that change.
Right.
I love that, because the anti-hero is almost a servant.
Exactly. Well, and like you said, it just is. It just is there. Whether you acknowledge it or not, it's an aspect of how you show up in every circumstance. There's a villain hanging out in there, and you want to deny it, stuff it down into your shadow, and then that winds up being something that, Jung would have said you project. You just project your shadow onto somebody else, and then they become the bad guy. And it's okay to hate those people over there because they're so different from me. And while, over here is all heroes and just good guys and whatnot. That's just not the case, right? If you had been born that person, you would be doing exactly what they're doing. Everybody out there is doing the thing that makes the most sense to them at the time, given what they know about the world, right? Even like the enemies to us here in the West, right? Like what's driving people to quote unquote terrorism? It's a love for God at the center of it. Their understanding of who God is and what love for God entails is radically different from the way that I see a bunch of those things. But I have to acknowledge that that's what's at the heart of a ton of the conflict between East and West is supposed love for God, right?
Yeah.
How do we come to the table and talk about, like, why does that show up that way for you and this way for me? And I'm all about figuring out how to be like the psychedelic Jimmy Carter. Let's do some like MDMA assisted diplomacy or something overseas.
I would be
Here am
all,
I, send me.
all for that. That would be great. I would even volunteer. So
I don't know what any of that would look like, but I was saying on a podcast last year, I think MDMA assisted therapy should be a part of what's offered to military families, just as a part of the deployment cycle. We're not going to stop deploying people. The world's not going to just magically become a peaceful place overnight. I don't have any illusions about any of that, having seen it firsthand and knowing that, that capacity is inside of me everywhere I go as well. But I do think we can handle some of that stuff better. And now, like, the DoD set aside $10 million to try to look at doing MDMA assisted therapy for active duty soldiers and their families. So I'm just going to go ahead and, manifest MDMA assisted diplomacy too here and see if we can get some money thrown that way.
The world would change so much. So
yeah. And I think we can do it, and just, I don't have any illusions about it happening, too fast, but I think we could do it in a few generations, maybe.
So what do you think? So what do you think is next in closing, where we are with ketamine? Because you hear things like Matthew Perry. There's been a lot of negative press in what's going on with that, and I think you kind of hit it. I mean, one of the things that you can go and do anything and abuse it, and you can. I find it ironic. We talk about drugs. And that was really, I think, kind of the frame that I always share in my stories, is that, when I was at the worst, lowest part and my friends were turning to assisted therapy with psychedelics, I said, no, they're drugs. No, they're not godly or not Christian. And my doctor actually said, dude, I give you drugs from a lab that I have no idea where they come from. And he's like, this doesn't even make sense, this argument. And I remember coming home like, I got nothing. Like, I have no frame for that. And I'm like, I'm in the healthcare business. And I'm like, okay. So it was life-changing for me. But there are still people out there who have these pretexts that, Matthew Perry, ketamine killed him, or that psychedelics are wrong, or there's tons of stories. So
yeah, I mean, welcome to planet Earth, where nothing is a non-zero risk factor, right? Like, everything's got sharp edges around here. Like, you can fall from standing height and die. It happens sometimes. Like, this is a risky place to do business. It's just being on planet Earth in the first place. And yeah, absolutely. We find a way to abuse anything. Like, obesity is an epidemic at this point. Food is amazing. What a beautiful gift. I want it all inside me now, right? Like, that happens, right? We can figure out a way to make anything harmful. So it's an important thing. Like I learned in Sunday school about what's called structure and direction. All of the structural things, all the things that are part of the created order of the universe, are inherently good, but we orient them in a whole bunch of different directions. And what direction you point it in matters. That's the difference between whether you're using your power for good or for evil. Or, like, I like to think from now on, I only use power for good or for awesome. Is what I'm committed to at this point. But yes, you can take that structurally good thing, medicine, food, water, land ownership, whatever you want, and you can orient it in a direction that is just shooting yourself in the foot. And I think that there's plenty of examples of that, Matthew Perry being one that has grabbed headlines recently. And unfortunately, I think that's an obvious example of an unfortunate situation where people, took advantage of someone, and the outcome was tragic. And I think there's plenty of ways to very easily prevent that by just keeping things out in the daylight, being above board with it. There are, standardized protocols created by, whole hosts of medical professionals who just want good things in the world as much as they're aware of it. And following those sorts of things, like there's a way to do this safely, intelligently, and with as little risk as possible, and then acknowledging that the risks are there and attempting to mitigate them rather than pretending that they don't exist is the best way forward.
And I think you kind of alluded to it earlier on. I mean, that's why you have people come into your office. So, because if it's done at home or it's done outside, there's lots of abuse. When
Right.
this whole story came out, I immediately thought of the Slacker family. Like, I mean, they purposely knew that opioids were dangerous.
Right.
Yet it became the fourth sign. Like,
Right.
I mean, so somehow that was okay. And now we're going to vilify ketamine and the amazing work that it's been going on. And then even further back, like vilifying MDMA, which we all know was used in the 70s and the 80s for family counseling and therapy long before it became a party drug. So
Right.
we have very short memories, I think. And hopefully within the next 6 months to a year, while tragic, we will see that it outweighs the unfortunate tragedy that happened.
Yeah, I mean, the benefits already demonstrated from both psilocybin and MDMA in clinical trials are just light years ahead of anything we've been able to develop otherwise. So
Yeah.
I think their time is coming, and it is very short before we'll see some significant changes, which is just a turn back to how we managed mental health as a people for thousands of years prior to, the effects of the Industrial Revolution and the information age. But we're just kind of turning back to our roots here meaningfully, I think.
I love that. We're turning back to our roots. So, Doc, Ben, Deadpool,
Alan.
Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, brother.
This is Alan Wiederhold. I am the CEO and founder of Numa Health. We will carry on more about that conversation later, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure.